So Arini made a video. In the video, I forget what it was entitled, but it was basically Arini talking to a bunch of groups and saying how a bunch of groups suck. And how people in the United States, whites especially in the United States, lack any direction, lack any focus. They lack any real coherent ideology. They're falling for a bunch of populists and demagogues. He even says that Hitler was the greatest leader that white people worldwide have ever had. And by greatest, he doesn't necessarily mean best or anything like that. He just means great. And great can be good or bad or a mixture of good and bad. Right? And the idea that Hitler was the greatest leader that whites have had in the past, say, 100 years, that's arguable. I think that's arguable. I think that's it's not an absurd position on its face. Anyway, a problem that I see, and he chides white people for lacking any coherent ideology, lacking any coherent anything. A problem I see is that there's nowhere to jump to. If we take a look at, say, the libertarians, that's just one group. Take a look at the libertarians. Say you're a libertarian. What are you going to do? Where can you go? You're going to vote Ron Paul, you're going to vote Libertarian, you're going to support the Libertarian Party, you're going to give money to CATO, you're going to give money to the Mises Institute. What are you going to do? All these things are dead ends. Now, I know that's a real... I've seen the endowment that the Mises Institute gets. I've seen the revenues that the Mises Institute gets and what the CATO Institute gets. It's lots. I'll have links in the description. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's like, it's tens of millions. I think like well over 100 million for the CATO Institute. And these organizations don't do much at all. Big words, big claim. Well, they don't, these kinds of organizations, I've said that they're dead ends, and I mean that by their very nature. Certainly, the Mises Institute has done more than to even compare myself to the Mises Institute as a height of hubris. But certainly, the Mises Institute has done far more, has been far more effective than me or Stefan Molyneux, Ray Dawson, or any of these kinds of people. Okay. Certainly, the Mises Institute has done a lot more and gotten a lot farther, but they are a dead end. Right? They've gotten a lot farther, but ultimately, by their very nature, they are a dead end organization. Okay. The reason they're a dead end organization is because there's no chance that they're ever going to get an electoral majority in the United States. There's no chance. Okay. Because people are not libertarians by nature, in general. Some people are, but most people are not libertarians. They're not going to be persuaded towards libertarianism. And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that reality? We've seen this libertarian movement trying to persuade people, just tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, trying to persuade people into libertarian ideas. And it's gotten more libertarians, but it's nowhere near winning. Right? It can't even dominate the Republican Party, which is the weaker of the two parties now, and I think permanently weaker. And of course, if you want to go with the hard right, white nationalist outfits, right, of course, in today's context of what is left and what is right, there's nothing going. Now, libertarians and the hard rightists, sometimes there's overlap, sometimes there's vehement opposition. There's lots of libertarians who hate the hard right. Some libertarians who are smitten with the hard right, right? They tend to have blinders on. They tend to see, we're so marginalized, we can't get anywhere, we can't get our policies enforced. What I think they miss a lot of is how other groups that they don't like are in a similar bind. Right? The hard left is not a fan of wars. The hard left is not a fan of the police state. The hard left is not a fan of well, there are certain consistent elements in the hard left that are not a fan of gun control, okay, because they recognize it as civilian disarmament. There are elements of the hard left that don't like the corporate state. They don't like the financial system and the corporatocracy and the special deals that the banks get, right? The special interest rate that only they have access to, funded by the Fed printing money, which causes inflation, which is basically a tax on the poorest, right? Because the poorest, they spend a disproportionate amount of their income and save a disproportionately low amount of their income, so they're the most hit by inflation. So it's a regressive tax. And there are some people who recognize this and oppose this, and they see the system, this corporate crap, just getting worse and worse and worse. And people on the hard left, and they're looking at the United States as totalitarianism abroad getting worse and worse and worse, right? I mean, it waggles, but it waggles up. Okay, the general trend has been, the past 50 years, maybe 100 years, has been more intervention, more U.S. control, more wars, more crap. Okay? And so it's not just libertarians on the hard right who feel marginalized. And so when Irini comes in and says, why do you guys suck so much? Well, what is there to do? People say, well, there's a failure to launch. There's a failure to get anywhere. I just feel like we're going around in circles. We get in our own little forums, our own little inbred groups. There's no going out. There's no activism. There's no spreading the ideas, or at least spreading something that can allow for a breakout. And that's what the ANP should be seen as, not really to convince anyone of anything other than a breakout, right? Pan-secessionism of some sort is the breakout. And that's what needs to be done. Realistically, you're not going to convince people of your ideology. You don't need to fight that hard fight of convincing other people of your ideology. All you need to do is convince them to live and let live. Say, we don't like each other. We don't have to like each other. We just have to work together for a little while and break out, have a partition. Now, if you talk to someone in public and they say, well, what's the specific plan for partition? You don't need to answer that. You don't need to answer that. Why should you answer that? Do you know? No. It's a bit of a silly idea that I would have all the answers of a specific partition. Of course, I have my ideas, and I have presented my ideas, but that's all they are. Okay? When you actually get closer and closer to a point where partition becomes feasible, more and more experts are going to start weighing in. More and more people who know more about the situation are going to weigh in. And the partition is going to get more and more sensible the closer you get to actually being able to do it, because pan-secession, the pan-secessionist movement, will have picked up so much steam and will have so many experts coming out of the woodwork and weighing in. Right now, what is it? Right now it's me and Keith Preston and a bunch of scattered peeps around the interwebs. That's really what it is now. And so to ask us for a specific plan, or to ask a man on the street who says, I support pan-secession, for a specific plan, is silly. We're not there yet. And so if someone to ask you that for the specific plan of secession and partition, tell them no. I don't have the plan. I don't need the plan. We're not at the point where it even makes sense to get too specific. At this point, it's just about principles, about general principles, self-determination, sovereignty, live and let live. Right? And it's pretty simple. Not trying to convince you of an ideology. We're just trying to give everyone somewhere to launch.